What if everything you were taught about human differences was built on a foundation that doesn't actually exist in our DNA? Scientists ran the largest genetic study in history, and what they found didn't just surprise them, it silenced the room. Before we go any further, if you want science that actually makes you rethink things, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the like button, and share this video with someone who needs to see it, because what you're about to hear changes everything. Imagine spending years collecting DNA samples from over 1,000 people. Not from one country, not from one continent, from 52 different populations spread across every corner of the planet. Indigenous communities deep in the Amazon rainforest, nomadic groups crossing the steppes of Central Asia, remote villages tucked away in the Himalayas, isolated island communities in the Pacific, people whose ancestors had lived in the same lands for thousands of years. Now imagine that, after all that work, after all those samples, after processing millions of genetic data points, the results come back and nobody in the room knows what to say. Not because the equipment failed, not because something went wrong, but because the data didn't match what anyone expected. The patterns in the DNA didn't align with the categories humans had spent centuries building. The boundaries that seemed so clear and so obvious in the visible world, the differences we see with our eyes every single day, those boundaries were barely visible in the actual genetic code. This is the story of what scientists discovered when they sat down and compared real human DNA from across the entire planet. It is one of the most important scientific discoveries of the last few decades, and most people have never fully heard it. Let's start at the beginning. The study is known as the Human Genome Diversity Project. It kicked off in the early 1990s with a goal that was considered bold, and at the time, controversial. The scientists behind it wanted to collect genetic samples from indigenous and geographically isolated communities before modern globalization and population mixing could blur the genetic signals they were looking for. That goal immediately sparked debate. Critics raised serious questions about consent. They worried about exploitation. They asked whether it was ethical to treat ancient human communities as biological archives. Those concerns were legitimate. They were taken seriously. And they shaped how the project was designed and carried out. But the data the project eventually produced was extraordinary. Samples came from 52 populations across Africa, Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, East Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. Each sample was analyzed using the most advanced DNA sequencing technology available at the time. The raw numbers filled enormous amounts of digital storage, and when the analysis software finished its work, the very first thing researchers saw on the screen became one of the most referenced figures in all of human biology. Any two human beings chosen completely at random from anywhere on Earth share approximately 99.9% of their DNA. Let that sink in for a moment. A person from Beijing and a person from Nairobi, a person from Oslo and a person from Lima, a person from Seoul and a person from Lagos. Pick any two people on this entire planet, from any two populations, from any two continents, and the genetic difference between them averages out to roughly 1 letter in every 1,000 letters of the genetic code. The other 999 letters are identical. Now, that figure alone wasn't entirely new in 2002. Scientists had been moving in that direction for years. But what the Human Genome Diversity Project added was something nobody had ever had before. A detailed, precise map of where that tiny 0.1% of variation actually sits, how it spreads across populations, and what it tells us about the real history of our species. And this is where things got truly unexpected. The first major finding was about Africa. When researchers mapped genetic diversity across all 52 populations and all 7 geographic regions, they discovered something that completely flipped the intuitive picture most people carry in their heads. The greatest genetic diversity on Earth is not found between continents. It is not found between the populations that look the most visually different from each other. The greatest genetic diversity on Earth lives within Africa. Two people from neighboring villages in Ethiopia could, at the level of actual DNA, be more genetically different from each other than either of them is from a randomly selected person in Sweden or Canada. That result needs some unpacking, because once you understand why it's true, everything else in this story clicks into place. Modern humans first appeared in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. For the overwhelming majority of that time, our ancestors stayed there. Populations expanded across the continent, separated into distinct groups, adapted to vastly different environments, built up their own unique genetic variations over tens of thousands of years, then came back together, mixed, separated again. 300,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time for genetic diversity to accumulate. By the time any group of humans first packed up and left Africa, the continent already held an enormous library of genetic variation, the product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, separation, mixing, and adaptation. What traveled out of Africa was not the whole library. It was a single chapter. The current scientific consensus places the primary out-of-Africa migration at somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago. A relatively small group of people crossed into what is now the Middle East, and from there, over tens of thousands of years, their descendants spread across Asia, Europe, Australia, and eventually the Americas. Here's the key insight. When a small group leaves a larger population, they can only take with them the genetic variation that exists among those specific individuals. They cannot represent the full genetic diversity of everyone they left behind. Geneticists call this the founder effect. Picture a jar filled with 100 marbles in dozens of different colors. Those colors represent all the genetic variation present in Africa. Now imagine someone reaches into that jar, pulls out 15 marbles, and puts them in a new jar. Those 15 marbles are the founding group that migrated out. Even if that small group eventually multiplies into billions of people spread across every continent on Earth, the total range of variation in all those billions can never exceed what was in those 15 original marbles. And no matter how far they spread, those billions will always represent less total diversity than the original jar. The genetic data confirmed this model with stunning precision. Diversity decreased in a clean, consistent pattern as researchers traced migration routes outward from Africa. Populations in the Middle East showed less diversity than African populations. European populations showed less than Middle Eastern ones. East Asian populations showed less than Central Asian ones. And Native American populations, representing some of the most recent major migrations, crossing into the Americas over a land bridge during the last ice age, showed the least overall genetic diversity of any group studied. The pattern was exact. Every migration out of Africa was a genetic bottleneck. Every founding group carried less variation than the population it came from. Every population living outside Africa today is, in a precise genetic sense, a subset of the variation that existed within Africa before anyone left. All roads lead back to Africa. The data made that undeniable. Now here comes the second major finding, the one that created the deepest silence in the room. When researchers examined the specific genes responsible for the physical traits humans have historically used to categorize each other, the traits we associate with what we call race, they found something remarkable. Those traits represent less than 0.1% of the total human genome. Skin color, hair texture, eye shape, the features that have driven centuries of classification, conflict, and cruelty, they are encoded in a tiny sliver of our genetic code. And in evolutionary terms, they are extremely recent. The genetic variants responsible for lighter skin in European populations appeared roughly 8,000 years ago. In a species that has existed for 300,000 years, 8,000 years ago is the blink of an eye. Blue eyes, a trait many people think of as a defining European characteristic, appeared even more recently. Current genetic evidence suggests the specific mutation that produces blue eye color first emerged somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, likely in one individual or a small cluster of people living near what is now the Black Sea. Every single blue-eyed person alive today traces that specific genetic variant back to that single point of origin. It's brand new in the grand timeline of human history. These visible features evolved because they provided survival advantages in specific environments. Darker skin offers protection against intense ultraviolet radiation near the equator. Lighter skin enables more efficient vitamin D production in northern regions where sunlight is weaker and winters are long. Certain eye shapes may have offered protection against cold winds and reflected glare in the environments where they developed. These are functional responses to local conditions. They are not markers of deep genetic separation between populations. They are recent, surface-level adaptations to different places. And here's the thing that makes it even clearer. The phenomenon scientists call convergent evolution. Populations in Aboriginal Australia and populations in southern India both evolved very dark skin. But these two groups are not closely related genetically. They adapted to intense sun exposure independently through different genetic pathways because they faced similar environmental pressures in different parts of the world. The actual DNA mutations that produce dark skin in one group are not the same mutations that produce dark skin in the other. They arrived at the same solution through completely different genetic routes. This is exactly what you see when you compare dolphins and sharks. Both developed streamlined bodies and fins. But one is a mammal and the other is a fish. Similar environments, similar pressures, similar outcomes. Completely different underlying biology. The same principle explains why visible traits don't map cleanly onto any real genetic structure. The genetic ability to digest milk as an adult appears in some northern European populations, in certain East African pastoral communities, and in groups across Central Asia. It evolved wherever people raised dairy cattle, because it was useful in those specific cultural and agricultural contexts, not because of race. Two people from different so-called racial backgrounds whose ancestors both kept cattle might share this trait. Two people from the same so-called racial background whose ancestors had different food histories might not. The genetics simply does not follow the categories. Now, take a moment right here. If this video is making you think differently about things you thought you already understood, that's exactly the point. Screenshot your favorite moment, tag a friend who needs to hear this, and drop a comment below with the word origin so I know you made it this far. Let's keep going. Now we get to the twist that almost nobody talks about, because it complicates the picture in a direction that nobody predicted. When scientists began extracting DNA from ancient human remains, they discovered something that fundamentally changed what it even means to be human. When modern humans spread out of Africa into Eurasia, they encountered Neanderthals, a distinct human species that had lived in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. And what happened next wasn't just competition or coexistence. They interbred. The genetic evidence for this is now solid and has been confirmed across multiple independent studies. Most people alive today whose ancestry traces to Europe or Asia carry between 1% and 4% of their genome from Neanderthal ancestors. This isn't an error or a contamination in the data, it's inheritance. That genetic material has been passed down through generations for tens of thousands of years and exists inside billions of living people right now. And it doesn't stop there. A separate ancient human group called the Denisovans, known primarily from bone fragments and teeth found in a cave in Siberia, also contributed to the modern human genome. Populations in Melanesia and among Aboriginal Australians carry up to 4 or 5% of their genome from Denisovan ancestry. Some modern humans carry genetic contributions from at least 3 separate human populations: anatomically modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. The idea of a single pure human lineage isn't just historically wrong, it's biologically impossible. Even the boundary of what we call human is blurrier than we assumed. And here's what makes this especially relevant. The populations that carry the highest percentages of Neanderthal DNA are not African populations. They are European and Asian populations. The groups that older racial science historically placed at the top of its invented hierarchy actually carry more genetic material from a separate human species than the African populations that same science ranked at the bottom. The genetic data inverts the hierarchy entirely. The ancient DNA findings kept adding complexity. Modern Europeans are not primarily descended from the people who first inhabited Europe after the last ice age. Scientists extracting DNA from ancient skeletons across Europe found that the hunter-gatherer populations who lived there after the glaciers retreated were largely replaced by incoming farmers who arrived from what is now Turkey about 9,000 years ago. And that wasn't the last wave. Around 5,000 years ago, a third group, pastoral people from the Eurasian steppe, swept into Europe and contributed substantially to the genetic makeup of modern European populations. Modern Europeans are a 3-way mixture of populations, none of whom had any concept of Europe as a category, because it didn't exist as one when any of this was happening. The same story plays out everywhere you look. The Han Chinese population, often treated in casual conversation as a single genetic group, is the result of northern and southern populations merging over thousands of years of history. The genetic diversity within China rivals the diversity across the entire European continent. Native American genetics turned out to be even more surprising. Researchers expected to trace Native American ancestry back to a single founding migration across the Bering Land Bridge. What they actually found was far more complicated. Some South American native populations carry genetic markers linking them not only to Siberian ancestors, as expected, but also to populations related to Aboriginal Australians and people from Papua New Guinea. A genetic connection between populations separated by the entire Pacific Ocean. The mechanism behind that connection is still being actively investigated. But what the data clearly shows is that human migration across this planet was far more complex, far more interconnected, and far more surprising than any simple story ever suggested. And then there's the finding about common ancestry that carries perhaps the deepest implication of all. Mathematical models built from the genetic data suggest that the most recent common ancestor of every person currently alive on Earth lived approximately 3,000 years ago, not a symbolic ancestor, not a metaphor, an actual person who lived roughly 3,000 years ago, whose genetic lineage flows through the family trees of every single human being alive today, regardless of where they live, what they look like, or what language they speak. Your family tree and the family tree of someone born on the other side of the planet converge. But when researchers examined how racial categories were being used across hundreds of published genetic studies, they found a persistent confusion at the core. Many studies treated African ancestry as though it represented a single, relatively uniform biological population, when the actual genetic picture shows the exact opposite. a continent containing more internal diversity than the rest of the world combined. That confusion isn't just a philosophical problem. When a category that doesn't reliably track biology gets used as a proxy for biology in a clinical setting, it can skew research results, and in the worst cases, it can affect patient care. Understanding that ancestry is a gradient, not a set of fixed boxes, is already reshaping how disease risk gets studied and how treatment decisions get made. This is not abstract. It has real consequences for real people. So where does all of this leave the old framework? The one Samuel Morton built out of seeds and skulls? The one that assumed humanity divided neatly into a handful of fixed biological races with separate destinies? It leaves it in ruins, not because scientists set out to dismantle it for political reasons. It fell apart simply because the actual data never supported it in the first place. The deepest genetic splits in humanity are inside Africa, not between Africa and everywhere else. The most recent and relatively uniform genetic populations are the ones furthest from Africa, the people whose ancestors left through the narrowest of founding groups. Visible traits, like skin color, are controlled by a small, fast-changing set of genes that respond to sunlight exposure, and they reveal almost nothing about the deeper architecture of human ancestry. And when researchers directly tested whether self-reported race corresponds to distinct genetic clusters in the largest, most diverse dataset ever assembled, it simply didn't. Ancestry is a gradient. It always was. A slow, continuous spectrum of shared and overlapping histories, not a filing cabinet with labeled folders for each race. A better mental image than a family tree with neat, separate branches is something closer to a river system. Picture countless tributaries that branch and rejoin, split apart and merge back together over thousands of miles. Neanderthal water flows in. Denisovan water flows in. Ghost population water flows in from a source we haven't even identified yet. Every person alive today is a unique confluence point in that river system, carrying traces of migrations, isolations, encounters, adaptations, and reunions, stretching back 300,000 years. Almost none of which lines up with the handful of simple categories a 19th century doctor once tried to build from seeds and a measuring scale. And if you've made it this far, you've just absorbed something that most people will never take the time to understand. You now know that the genome doesn't divide along racial lines. You know that the oldest human diversity lives inside Africa, not between continents. You know that Neanderthal DNA is in living humans right now. You know there's a ghost species embedded in our DNA that we've never found a single bone of. And you know that when scientists actually tested racial categories against real genetic data in a massive modern study, those categories dissolved into overlapping gradients. That's not a small update to how you think about human beings. That's a fundamental reframe. Here's your final challenge before you go. Don't let this just be something you watched and moved on from. Go find one person today, someone you actually talk to, and tell them the two people in Africa fact. The one where two people on the same continent can be more genetically different than a Norwegian and a Japanese person. Watch their reaction. Start that conversation. If this video gave you something real, the comment section is open. Tell me what shifted for you. And if you want more content that takes what science actually says seriously, subscribe and stay close because there's a lot more coming that will hit just as hard. The genome has been telling us the truth this entire time. We just needed the tools and the honesty to finally listen. What if everything you were taught about race turned out to be scientifically wrong? Not slightly off, but backwards. Two people standing close to each other on the same continent can be more genetically different from each other than a person from Norway is from a person in Japan. That single fact breaks the entire system of race. If that just made your brain pause, you're exactly where this video needs you to be for this story. Hit that like button right now, subscribe so you never miss content like this, and share this with your friends. Let us go back to the beginning, not just a few hundred years, not even a few thousand, back 300,000. At a time when modern humans were just emerging on Earth, the story that unfolds from that point forward shatters. For most of human history, people sorted each other by what they could see. Skin color, hair texture, eye shape. These visible differences felt meaningful. They felt like nature drawing clean lines between groups. But science made it much worse. In the early 1800s, Samuel Morton built an entire reputation on the idea that race was a measurable biological fact. He collected hundreds of human skulls from battlefields and graveyards to measure how much volume they could actually hold inside. More volume, he believed, meant a bigger brain. A bigger brain meant a more superior race. He ranked entire groups. For decades, his numbers were treated as serious science. They shaped legislation and gave cover to the institution of slavery. The idea that race was a fixed, physical truth became so deeply planted in Western thought, it was never questioned. Then came DNA. When scientists finally developed the tools to read the actual genetic code inside human cells, everything changed. Researchers expected to find clean genetic boundaries, a distinct fingerprint for each race, a clear line for white and black. What they found instead was nearly the exact opposite of everything they were looking for in the human genetic code. In the year 2000, the first complete draft of the human genome was announced at the White House for all. One of the lead scientists involved said the concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis at all now. That statement sounds bold, but the data behind it is even more disorienting. The genome actively contradicts the racial map. If race were a real biological category like species, you would expect deepest differences to exist between the separate races. Europeans versus Africans, Asians versus everyone else. That was the picture Morton was chasing for all of those long years. But when geneticists actually mapped where the oldest, deepest divisions in the human family tree exist, that picture completely collapsed. The deepest splits in all of human DNA are not between Africa and Europe, or between Asia and the Americas. The deepest splits on Earth are between different populations living inside Africa itself. Groups like the Khoisan and the Pygmy, these groups separated from the rest of humanity tens of thousands of years before anyone even left the African continent. These are the oldest distinct genetic lineages on Earth. The distance between them dwarfs the distance between Asians and Europeans. Let that land for a second. The two people standing a few hundred miles apart in Africa are extremely different. They can carry more ancient, more deeply diverged genetic histories than an entire migration of people who left Africa together. The word African, as a racial label, is doing something almost completely backwards from what most people actually assume. In genetic terms, it does not describe a narrow group. It describes the widest, oldest, most internally diverse branch ever. Every other population on Earth descends from a relatively narrow founding group that split off between 50,000 and 70,000 years. In other words, everyone else is a smaller, younger branch, growing from just one corner of the massive African tree. This means that, in a purely biological ancestral sense, every human being alive today is African, literally without any metaphor. Homo sapiens as a species was born on the African continent. Remarkable remains in Morocco push modern features to 300,000. For the first 200,000 years, our species stayed almost entirely within Africa. Groups were already splitting apart and migrating internally. Those are the oldest chapters in human genetic history. They happened long before the concept of race existed in form. So where did racial categories actually come from? The answer is geography, recent geography when small groups left the continent. They became isolated for thousands of years. During that isolation, random genetic mutations accumulated. Some mutations affected visible physical traits. Over generations, these visible differences became the surface features people use to draw lines between groups. But this changes everything. Visible traits are a tiny slice of the genome. Judging human ancestry by skin color is like judging books by covers. The genes that control pigmentation are few in number. They tell almost nothing about the deeper patterns of ancient ancestry. On average, human beings are about 99.9% identical to each other at the DNA level, regardless of ancestral continent. Within that tiny margin, there is more genetic variation inside a single race than there is. Every population blends gradually into every neighboring population. Two people both labeled white in a census form can be more genetically geographic line one of them and Asians. The categories were reflecting what was easiest to see from the outside, never what was actually underneath the human skin. Biologists have a term for genuine, distinct groups within a species, subspecies, but humans don't split into subspecies. Every population blends gradually into every neighboring population through continuous variation. There is no geographic line for human DNA. What exists instead is a gradient, a slow, rich variation that is thickest and most complex in the African continent. It becomes progressively more uniform the further out you trace human migration. Every group started from a smaller founding population. Pause here for a moment, because this next part matters enormously to the story. This is known for 2 decades. If this is reshaping something you thought you understood, take a second and smash that share button right now. Now let's keep going, because it gets even stranger. This all comes from studying living human DNA and ancient bones. Scientists have developed the ability to extract genetic material from ancient bones that are tens of thousands of years old. In 2009, scientists successfully sequenced the full genome of a Neanderthal, a separate species that lived alongside our ancestors. Did modern humans and Neanderthals actually interbreed when their paths crossed? The genome gave an unambiguous answer. Yes, they did. People of European descent today carry roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA sitting quietly in their genome right now. A genetic memory of meetings that happened tens of thousands of years ago, preserved in living cells for us today. In a cave in Russia called Denisova, researchers found a tiny fragment of bone and a single molar tooth here. Scientists extracted a full genome from those fragments. It was something completely new, a previously unknown branch called the Denisovans. The Denisovans also interbred with our ancestors. Their genetic contribution is written into living human DNA in the East today. The further east you travel, the more Denisovan ancestry appears in modern populations, and the less Neanderthal ancestry you see. But here is the detail that stopped researchers cold. The numbers of ancient DNA didn't fully add up for them. There appears to be at least one more archaic human species that interbred with our ancestors. A ghost species now. We don't know what it looked like. It never got a name because we never found it, but traces remain. An entire lost branch of humanity surviving only as scattered fragments spread across the genomes of its distant living descendants. Researchers call it genetic archaeology. Instead of digging through Earth, they dig through the genome to find traces of people. Every new dataset reveals another layer of mixing, another lost population, another migration that nobody had ever documented before. Human history was never a single clean line. It was always a tangle of tributaries branching and merging through time. When farming emerged roughly 10,000 years ago, it didn't just change what people ate. It changed human biology itself forever. The ability to digest milk comfortably into adulthood is a genetic mutation that offered a genuine survival advantage for early herders. Today, most people of European descent carry that mutation. Most people worldwide still don't. It's about recent cattle herding. A massive study using the All of Us research program analyzed roughly 2 million genetic variants across 230,000 participants recently. Does the race people report actually correspond to clean, distinct genetic clusters in the data? It simply did not happen. Most participants showed broad, overlapping gradients of ancestry. Categories like Hispanic or Latino showed a genuinely broad mixture of continents. A bioethicist reviewing the study put it plainly: researchers should stop defaulting to broad continental racial categories because they are artificial. Understanding that ancestry is a gradient, not a set of fixed boxes, is already reshaping how disease risk is studied. The deepest genetic splits in humanity are inside Africa, not between Africa and everywhere else on the entire planet Earth. Ancestry is a gradient. It always was. A slow, continuous spectrum of shared and overlapping histories, not a filing cabinet. Every person alive today is a unique confluence point in that river system, carrying traces of migrations and ancient isolations. You now know that the genome doesn't divide along racial lines. You know the oldest diversity lives inside Africa itself. Go find one person today and tell them the 2 people in Africa fact. Watch their reaction. Start that conversation with them. The genome has been telling us the truth this entire time. We just needed the tools and the honesty to listen.